So I'm going to do what we call a working knife video, and just kind of a preemptive, just a couple of thoughts going into it. And as I'm kind of working with the video end of it a little bit on my end, I'm trying to focus back on if I was working with a group or when I work with groups and individuals. Some of the lessons. So I'm trying not to get too scattered in, break off into too many areas at once. So normally when I'm working with a group, I'll start with usually the larger tools and the basics of the tools and basic, cutting techniques and stuff like that. So it may be a large, maybe a machete, axe, saw, that type of thing, and then have them as they become comfortable and confident in it, have them kind of work down into some of the smaller tools that, obviously we have, maybe a working knife, some of the smaller belt knives, that type of thing. So I'm going to try and hold a little bit more of a focus that way. One of the things that, over the years of doing this and obviously doing this solo a lot in the earlier years, one of the lessons for sure, and a good takeaway was, nature has no ego, right? And nor will it allow your ego to, to survive it. So one of the lessons there definitely has been in, some of the ways I use the tools, and when I had bigger tools, my focus was on maybe some larger growth opportunities, etc., and sometimes just by the situation that I ended up in, I ended up with, everything from a pocket knife to maybe a belt knife or a working blade in some colder temperatures and weather. It forced me to think a little bit differently, and I had to become a little bit more of an opportunist, and I'm going to use that word, in the way that I had to really look at the environment and what was available. And a lot of times I found that a lot of the lessons out of that were, I didn't have to have that, solo focus of that large standing dead, and where when I really looked around, there was a lot of stuff that, I could break up by hand. There was ways that I could use a smaller tool, maybe a belt knife, to procure limb and break up and drag in wood, and use it for, in the winter I use a lot of long fires that are pretty effective. So it just forced me to look at different things and become a little bit more of an opportunist, right? I would look at maybe stumps, and some dry stuff just to get that fire started. If there was pieces in there that I could dig into or bust out, and different ways of using the tools. So kind of some of the lessons that I've learned over the years, and I'm going to try and put that in some of these videos, and I'm kind of learning as I go a little bit here as well, and I'm trying not to get too scattered in jumping into many subjects. We all start in the same place, so I'm going to try and present this, with a little bit more of a strategy behind it. So bear with me through some of these videos, and I'll work now a little bit more on what I consider a working knife. How do I define a working knife? So a working knife is definitely going to be a little bit bigger than obviously the belt knife, which we kind of put into 6 inches or under, in kind of a weight category that's fairly light, easy to carry. A working blade, for the most part, how I define it, is it's going to be capable of chopping, so it's going to be a little bit heavier. We're going to use it, it's from a function side, it's probably going to split better, a little bit thicker. When we're batoning it or splitting wood, it's going to do a little bit better splitting than maybe a machete that's very thin. So chopping, weight, that type of thing. There are a variety of sizes that can kind of fit into this, and some that we talk about a little bit that might fall into a crossover. This is more of a tracker style by Wingner blades, and he makes some pretty effective blades for what I would call very useful blades. So this is one of his, and it's more of a tracker style. It's a 7-inch blade. It is capable of doing some chopping, but it also could fall into a belt knife, which in the winter might be a good choice as well, but a little bit heavier. Again, on the smaller side, from a working knife perspective, this is a Busey Ash 1, maybe an older style. It's a fairly thick blade. Cutting edge is about 6 inches, but it does fit into something that's capable of doing some chopping. So different varieties up to some of the larger knives, and even, I've got a couple of prangs that might fall into this that are probably close to, say, 10 inches. So I would put this into a larger working blade category as well, a little bit thicker so it can split, and definitely very effective for the chopping. So having said that, there's lots of different designs out there and different things that we can look at, but this one's one of the trackers. This is Beck, and there's some differences in this. I would put this into a working blade group. It's capable of chopping. This one has, like the originals, has a sawback on the back of it. And some of them, like this one, have a bit of a serrate in it. Probably, I've done a separate video on kind of serrates and sawbacks. If that's something that you want to look at, you can definitely reference that video. The way we're going to work some of these blades, the sawback can be a bit of a painful experience if we don't have gloves, and the way we're going to maybe draw through it or work the spine. So my preference normally is to have something that maybe doesn't have those on it when it comes to a working blade, but that's kind of a decision you have to think about as well. So I want to kind of touch, we're going to touch quickly, partial tang or a full tang. We'll review kind of some of the grinds, the types of blade grinds, that type of thing. And then I'll touch some videos on some of the ways, just to try and give you a perspective of some of the ways I do use some of these blades. And I'll try and get into a separate video when it comes to procuring wood and chopping techniques, that type of things. So first and foremost, we'll touch tang, so partial versus full tang. Most of the blades, or pretty much all the blades that I would put into a working knife category, will have a full tang, and that means the blade goes straight through right to the butt of the handle, and it's one piece of steel that gives us a little bit more strength versus maybe a partial tang that we might choose on some other blades. So for the most part, one of the things that I do looking at something that's going to fit more of a working blade is going to be a full tang. We're going to work this blade a little bit harder, so it's going to be splitting wood. We're going to be batoning with it, which has got a high vibration, and a lot of times a lot of the failures when it comes to the handles and that type of thing, you'll find that comes out very much when we're batoning. The other thing is, because we're using it for chopping, it gets a fair amount of impact. So it's a pretty hard on the blade when we're chopping and hitting some harder woods. And that's also where we can have a failure if it's not a full tang, as well as a lot of times where we're going to find that our edge and our tempering and the type of steel that we've chosen is going to be successful or not. So we've got some examples of that I'll maybe touch later. So having said that, so a full tang versus a partial tang, probably the preference is going to be the full tang. Quickly to kind of review the grinds, these four are a flat grind. So from the edge of the spine to the secondary bevel of the cutting edge, it is a full flat. So from a perspective of what does that give us? Well, it definitely gives us some meat in the blade, depending on the thickness as well. Some of the this is a wider blade, the RTAC, versus this is a Trailmaster. Is a little narrower from a span side, but when we look at the spine of it, and I don't know if you can see that there, the spine of the cold steel, the Trailmaster, is a fair amount thicker than say the RTAC in this case. So different attributes that'll come with this. Basically, the flat grind has a challenge of maybe more friction than a couple of the other designs, but robustness, and it can chop fairly effectively. It'll get a nice deep chop in some of them. So these two, the Hungalis and the RTAC, are fairly long blades, and they're fairly good choppers as well. So the thickness of the spine is also something we look at as well as we're going through these blades. So next up is, and this is probably the only example of a working blade that I have with a hollow grind or a concave grind. And just because we're going to use this fairly high impact, we have a little bit less meat. This one is an example of one that hasn't been too bad. I haven't had an issue with it. But I probably haven't used this as substantially as some of these other ones. So it's just something I normally don't have, a concave or hollow grind on some of my working knives. When it comes to machetes, most of the ones that have concaves have chipped out or, had some pretty major failures with them, so I kind of shy away from that. But there may be some designs out there that are effective. Again, next up, I'm going to touch, and this is a convex grind. So again, from the spine, it's slightly rounded out to the secondary bevel of the cutting edge. So it's a pretty effective grind. A little bit more meat in the blade, so we probably have a bit of a strength advantage with some of this design. It's may have less friction as we're pushing through wood because of the concave design. The wood may not touch 100% of the surface versus maybe a full flat when we're breaking down wood. So it's got some advantages. If it's and this is some of the challenges, depends on the design, the manufacturer, I guess, and or the skill of the knife maker. A good convex is very effective. Not all of them are maybe done as well, and the price point on a good convex seems to be a little bit higher, so you're going to pay a little bit more maybe for that knife with a good convex. And so this is another example of a decent convex, and this is one of the Buseys. So that being said, convex is a pretty effective grind. A little price point, a little bit higher. This one is the Kershaw Camp 10, pretty effective blade, pretty cost-effective blade. It's a saber grind. So in this case, it as much as this is also a recurved blade, it's not a full flat to the spine. It actually comes down and then flat down. So from a robustness of these blades, and I've got another one here. And this is maybe a good example as well as of a saber grind. It's not full flat to the top. It's about a third of the way down, and then goes flat down to our working edge or our cutting edge, where we have a secondary bevel on. In this case, this one has a sawback on it. Whatever that is. So to that point, the saber grinds are pretty effective as well. We may have less friction when we're breaking into it because it doesn't hit 100%. The wood isn't pressing or rubbing against 100% of the blade. We probably only have maybe a 2/3 in this case. So fairly robust. We got a little bit more steel in there as well. So that's just kind of a quick review on kind of the blade grinds and design. So, and last but not least, I'm going to, this is an example of a blade that uses 2 grinds on the cutting edge. And so there are some blades that definitely fall into some of this aspect and give us some different advantages, maybe, and opportunities depending on the design. So this one has a good convex on what I would consider the chopping or working edge here, and that comes into more of a hollow grind here, which gives us a lot more capability maybe of doing some finer work. I find this one works really well when we get into some of the videos I'll show you of using it as a draw knife, you know, to work into and sometimes break up some of the wood that we're going to look at. So this is another example of one that may fall into where there's multiple grinds on the blades, and there are a few of them around as well, and I'm finding more and more of them coming out. Next up, I'm just going to touch the carbon steel versus stainless quickly again. You know, we have these are more carbon steels, and then some of the stainless steels. So obviously the corrosion resistance of a stainless, if it's in a wet environment, might be a consideration. Usually that comes into play maybe with more of my diving knives or paddle vests, the knives that I carry there. Advantage of obviously the carbon steels, we've got some really good edge retention. Some of the steels are pretty robust if they're tempered, you know, if they're well tempered properly, and then the tempering's not too high where they chip out, and hopefully they roll over before that. So and for a price point, the carbon steels, we can get a pretty good knife with some good edge retention for a pretty comparable price. As in when we move to the stainlesses, we're going to find that in that price point, our edge retention and our ability to get that really sharp or shaving sharp edge may not be as attainable with some of the more cost-effective stainless steels. To get that edge retention, we're usually up into the more expensive steels, and there's the VG series, and some of the 690s, that type of thing. So more expensive on the stainless side to get a comparable edge retention as well. So something to keep in mind too. If price point, how important is the price point, or what are we looking at in that area? So also too, in this case, this is a little higher end carbon steel. So if I'm not mistaken, this is a N80 CR2V, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a pretty robust steel for sure. It's I've got a few of these, and I've worked them very hard, and I've never had an issue with this fellow's design anyway, and his tempering practice. So some of the steels we can get into some higher end carbon steels as well as some of the stainlesses. So just food for thought when we're purchasing a knife. If we get into some of the super steels and the powdered steels, I'm going to say do a little bit of research. They've got some really great edge retention, and they're pushing the hardness and the Rockwell hardness up into high 50s and low 60s. The edge retention is pretty good on them for sure, and that's the advantage, and the ability to sharpen it and bring it back is an advantage. But we may want to look at the type of steel with heavy use and heavy vibration. Some of them have not done so well, and we've had some pretty major fractures in some of the steels. So kind of look at what the attributes of that steel when we're getting into the super steels, and the edge retention and the hardness is one good thing, but we may not be able to get both necessarily with all the steels. We may lose some robustness of it, especially if it's high vibration or hard use. So that's also something to consider when we're looking at different knives. So the steels definitely can get into, there's a huge variety now out there. Some have had some really good success, and the price point is probably going to start going up when we get into some of those super steels, that type of thing. So food for thought in that one. So before I break into some clips and videos and try and give you guys an idea of how I kind of use these blades in some respects, I'm going to touch a couple aspects. One is with a working knife, it's something that a proper sheath is a little bit important, more so in the respect that, I'm just going to grab an example. So this is one of my sheaths for one of my working knives. With a working knife, I consider it to be something that I'm carrying with me, on me. Definitely in the colder times of the year, or the winter camping, stuff like that. It's definitely always on me when I'm procuring wood, and a lot of times when I'm moving through as well. In order to keep it with me, the type of sheath I use, and it's got to be convenient to to sheathe the blade as well as remove the blade without cutting jackets, or so if my sheath is too high up on my belt, maybe especially in the winter, I'm at risk of cutting some clothing, maybe that type of thing, my jackets, as well as it's not as convenient to sheathe and unsheath. And the intent is I want it on me at all times. I don't want to leave it in a stump or set it somewhere when I'm moving wood or dragging wood out. So it's always going to be on me. So one of the considerations too with a working knife is the type of sheath, and a little sheath that hangs a little bit lower is a little bit more convenient. I do like that idea. I'll go through a separate video on how I set some of these up, but for the most part, most of my knives, whether it be a belt knife or a working knife, I have usually maybe a ferro rod tied to it. In this case, this one I use and have used for many years. I've got a little bit more to it. I've got a flashlight, stone compass, and I've got some cordage and some other stuff in there that I can go through in another video as well as a ferro rod. So it covers my basic primary needs, and from the rule of threes type of thing, which is, we can touch again in another video. So food for thought. I've got a couple of different types that I work with, and some of the people that I spend a fair amount of time in the bush with may choose a different setup, and I've used both. So that's one that's kind of a lower slung sheath that's easy to access. So this is another setup that I've used and still do use. I use this maybe more in the summer at times, but it can be same thing. I can use it with a belt loop. This one I tend to sling, so it'll sling over my shoulder, and what I'll do is I'll slide it around to the back when I'm moving or hiking, and then when I'm going to use it, I pull it out and it sits in front of me. It's easy to access again. I can do my chore with it, whatever I'm going to do, limb my tree. I can put it back in the sheath and clip it and slide it back. It's now on me, but out of my way as well. So that's another option. And this one works really well, especially in the summer. I use it if we're in kind of marshy areas and pushing through, and so we're in and out of the water, dragging our boats through. Maybe I can sling it. My clothing in the summer, may consist of a bathing suit and a t-shirt. So I don't always maybe have a belt on, as well as when I'm in the canoe. A lot of times my knife can catch in the seat, or it gets a little bit snagged up. So if I'm in and out of the boat a lot, that's a consideration as well. I'm going to try and find, and I've got one here. So this is maybe the third option, and This is more of a Ranger style, so it hangs more parallel to the belt. So normally for a canoe trip, if I want this on me, I'll wear something like this that it doesn't dangle in and it doesn't catch in my seat on the canoe. It's on my back. It's not as convenient to get in and out. I leave my belt a little bit looser when I'm working it, so I can pull it around to the front, and I can pull the knife, and resheath it easily. So sometimes that works too. My preference for the most part in the winter is going to be more of a belt knife and hanging a little bit lower, so from an accessibility side. But those are a couple of options to think about. So with a working knife, the way I'm viewing it is it's always on me, it's always sheathed, I'm not at risk of losing it. Doing some solo tripping in the past, the last thing I wanted to lose was one of my main tools. So, and a lot of times it was my only tool in some instances. So I was very cognizant about it, always at having it sheathed and on me, never leaving it in a stump, that type of thing. So just something to think about as well. So we'll get into a couple of different techniques, and like I said, I'm gonna try and get into some clips. So for chopping, we can definitely use this for chopping, and I'll go through some videos just to kind of give us some short clip on it. We can also baton wood, split wood, so the working blades are probably a little longer, so they'll span maybe some bigger wood. And there's different ways. I don't always go through if it's a really big cut. I'll work the edges in necessarily, rather than trying to expend energy or try and split a really big piece that's got lots of knots and risk my blade or just the amount of time it takes to do it. There's more effective ways to work with it, and we'll touch that in another video. But so I'll definitely split wood with it, a little bit more capable, definitely more than maybe a machete. Limbing, it's very effective. So to quickly limb a tree, in the winter, long fires, I work a lot more long fires, limbing a tree and maybe busting it up in the middle, so I can, manage it into my area that I'm going to run my long fire in. So those are a few ways that I'll try and get some clips on. So we may also be using these blades into maybe busting up stumps and trying to dig out some dry out of it, and some partially rotten trees and stuff as they come over. There's still parts of it that we could use if we needed. So it definitely will work for that, and I'll try and give some examples of that. The other area that I've found these fairly effective, and definitely on the working knife because of the length of the span, is I tend to use them more of in a draw knife type of scenario. And it definitely can clean up a log if you're using it for a bed and you don't want maybe the knots and the pieces of branch type of thing sticking into you, as well as if I'm doing a shelter and I don't want to puncture a tarp. There's ways that instead of chopping it, I can draw it down. It's pretty effective. But also quickly breaking into wood rather than having to chop it down, split it. Sometimes I can do it with a draw fairly quick and fairly effectively, and depending on the grind and the blade design, sometimes it's very effective at breaking into wood very quick and getting some dry stuff out. So I'll try and give some examples in some of the videos, and we'll kind of break into some of that now.
All right, we're going. We're live. Makes quick work of it, eh? I think I gotta get me one of those.
As I was saying before, I'll put a piece of wood down just so I don't drive my blade into a rock or into the ground if I can help it. So usually when I'm batoning. So see, this is the Ontario SP50, a little bit thicker blade. Let's see how that. That's some pretty twisted wood, but you know what, no problem there. This is the Kershaw Camp 10.
It chops pretty good.
Yeah. So,
see, but this is your shock absorber when you're swinging it, right?
Well,
this is nice. It shouldn't be something hard.
We changed the angle, remember?
Yeah.
On the original one would have ended up pinching your fingers.
Yeah.
Right, and then we pulled it back so it doesn't pinch your fingers as much.
Yeah. Like I'm at this point, literally, I am almost not even holding the handle.
Yeah,
I'm just grabbing the last two so it doesn't go flying sideways.
You know, and that's
the string is cool. This is a nice idea because this is your shock absorber when you're swinging.
Yeah.
It's not like the hard handle like the other ones, where that tail comes right down.
Yeah, makes sense.
Oh yeah, big time. Big time. Well, pretty much.
So this piece is 1.5 inches, 2 inches, maybe a couple inches. Yeah. So different cuts, we can do a V cut, so whatever the depth of the cut is, we want to at least go that cup in a V cut if we were going to do that. This one's kind of in a, I don't know if just to explain it, I'm going to say a flying V. So basically I want to make a good hard chop, and on something big this probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you're probably going to work it around or do some V's, that type of thing. But in this case, if it's small enough, sometimes I can get through in 2 cuts, maybe 3, just enough to break it up. So this one's probably about 20-30 feet, kind of a long skinny one that's, I'm just going to break up so I can move it around. So what I mean, kind of a flying V, is I'm going to chop here, and I'm going to try and get a good cut, and then I'm going to move over and I'm going to try and do another cut here. So I'm going to get rid of some of the stuff that's in the way, and so I can get a good strike on it. And I'm going to try, and the more accurate I can be, maybe the more effective. If that doesn't go through, if I don't get a good heavy swing and a good nice cut on it, I can maybe punch in a couple more, right, knock out a chip, and then go a little bit deeper. I can also do another cut on the surface, right? And if I could, if I could roll the tree around, well, maybe I could do all 4 cuts. But so we'll try this with this one. And so one of the things from a safety perspective, I never do an outside cut. This is more the safe side, not so much here. If it's skinned off and I was up here and cutting and it's skinned off, it could come right into my foot. So I always want to have my foot at least in parallel. So I want to be chopping from here back if it's on the unsafe side of the limb or the tree we're trying to procure. So a little bit of a cut there. I don't know if that's deep enough, but so we've got one cut on this side. I'm going to do the same with this, but I'm going to observe the same thing. This is a little bit smaller branch in case it went through, and chunk down. I can probably get rid of that. If I work this a little bit, and then we're going to try and pry it out and kind of beat into it a bit. So this is kind of a medium-sized blade, which the advantage is I can do some drawing. And when I'm using it as a draw knife, as much as we think we're going to use our arms, use your body a bit and pull your body into it, drop your weight, and which also helps you lock your arms. So if it did slip, it's not coming into you. So if I drop my body and all of a sudden takes it off, I'm locking my arms. So we'll get some good chunks out of that. A little bigger knife, starting to get some bigger pieces, a little bit more leverage. Take a big piece until I get something broken loose. So in this case, maybe just even working down that way, and getting some decent pieces out of that. Rather than trying to hack through one big piece. Now we're starting to get into some decent chunks. So that's some decent wood. So a little bit bigger knife. I can use it easily for a draw knife, which helps. Still can do some chopping. So again, this is a Kershaw 10, and I'm going to give that a shot, and just the advantage there again is I can use it kind of as a draw knife in this instance, which may help. So I can do some chops in there. Starting to work some wood out of it, so off inside, and the outside is nice. So just different ways of using your tools. I will say a lot of times with some of the blades that maybe are not quite as heavy duty, right? Or and there's a lot of them that I probably wouldn't push this hard. This one, the Kershaw Camp 10, I've a little bit more confident in it for sure. The other one, Wenger's blades, he just uses a pretty higher end carbon steel for sure, a little bit more robust. So, and just through experience, I'll do this playing around here, in my backyard, but in the field or up in the backcountry,
you'd be cognizant of what your blade can and can't do, because there's a lot of failures I've had too, right? And back here, you know, I'll push a blade just to get some confidence in it, and even some of the more cost-effective ones, you know, back here, I want them to fail here, not in the backcountry, and I want to have some confidence in what they will or won't do. So there's definitely some blades that, when I'm doing this type of stuff, you know, are at risk, and I've had some failures for sure. But, you know, the advantage here is I've got a box of knives, so it you know, goes in the bin, in the naughty bin, and I grab another one. So, but over the years, you know, just some of the knives that, you know, and the Busey I've carried for years, and I have been very, very hard on it. And when I say I've used it for a crowbar, you know, basically a lot of this stuff is what you're doing with it. And but that's also built the confidence, and probably a big reason why I carry that blade so consistently, you know, from a bigger working knife blade. So, you know, personal preferences and stuff. You know, I've probably got quite a few. I've got some great blades and some really nice custom blades. You know, that I enjoy playing with and working with, but some I push. Wanger's blades I've probably pushed pretty hard in the last 4 or 5 years, and so as I get confidence with a blade, that's something I'll carry in the backcountry, just because I've probably been pretty hard on them, and I'm confident in what they will or won't do, right? So just food for thought. You know, I could split this with a baton for sure, split these up into finer pieces. You know, I may be able to just use kind of that draw knife action to get into some of this as well. There we go. So we've got, you know, some finer parts that we can start using for kindling. I can start working around this maybe a bit, as long as I can stabilize it. So, food for thought. You know, just kind of working through some of this stuff. This is maybe thin enough that, you know, definitely get through in a few chops. So, yeah, break it up fairly quick. You know, these blades a little bit heavier, you know, definitely have some chopping ability. So it, you know, it may not be quite that of the axe and the machete type of thing, but depending on the blade choice, you know, they're definitely capable, and that's what kind of sets them apart maybe from a belt knife idea. So, you know, get some depth on that. And, you know, thinking of different ways that we can make chops effective, right, rather than trying to do our standard V and go through it. Maybe, and some of the smaller stuff, there's some pretty effective ways, you know, with very few hits to kind of make this effective. So same thing, we'll try this here. You know, that actually broke pretty quick. Same thing there. Yeah, so different ways to think about it. Let's see if we can try baton this a bit. Yeah. Definitely can split it up into smaller pieces, you know, that way. And same thing, just push cuts. So break it down pretty quick. Like I say, get some of the rod off. The outside's actually still pretty good, so a lot of times that's, you know, good for the start of fire. Right? That's all you cut.